2019, Jared, before COVID. And we've since kept in touch talking about how we deal with issues of homelessness and how we assist us to deal with issues of homelessness in South Africa as well. Because the US has a massive challenge of homelessness. But very often there's issues that, Tim and I have been talking about on that relate to how we are responding to homelessness. And we always think that it's a shelter issue. And sometimes we get to a point of victim blaming in our context. And we really haven't found very sort of humane ways of dealing with homelessness and responding to homelessness and designing programs of homelessness. And there's, of course, an issue of homelessness as an unfunded mandate. But Jared has come up with quite a number of very innovative ways of dealing with homelessness in Kansas City and in other parts where he has worked. So he's been very gracious to allow to join us this morning, and it's very, very early his time. But we're looking forward to the conversation. But I don't want to take too much time, Jad, from your time. So please go ahead and start. So welcome all colleagues. So the colleagues that are here aren't only from the city, but they're also coming from other entities within our municipality and within the sort of the private sector entities, and I think there's NGO and some academic colleagues as well. We were expecting more people possibly to still come, but because of the situation we're faced with, we may not get all the people that we expect to attend today. So Jad, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Sandile. This is, I've had just a wonderful experience since I've met you and talking through some of the issues that we're going to talk about today, and I've been struck by how similar some of the same barriers are, regardless of the geography and regardless of the population. And so I'm really curious to hear feedback too, what the experience is around the world with some of these issues, because I've been enmeshed in this work here in the United States and in the Midwest of the United States for going on 20 years now, and there were just some common themes that just keep reoccurring. So I really appreciate the opportunity to talk through some of these things and to share some of my experience. But I'm really more interested in hearing the feedback to what's similar, what's different, what other people have seen work. So before I start any of that, before I get into kind of who I am and what I do just want to draw attention to the way that we perceive information generally. So there may be things that I say that cause someone to feel like I have something in common with them, or that we've shared an experience on the work front. And just know the things that I'm going to say, almost all of them are quantifiable. So whatever your initial judgment of me is, I would encourage you to just look into these things because they're either true or they're not, regardless of how well I present it. And so I find that to be a really relevant aspect of the work that we do, because so much of what we do ends up being kind of driven by our initial judgment of people. And I want to talk a lot about that too, because I think there are ways to insulate and mitigate that impact when we're talking about social policy, because I think the perception of deservedness really creeps into our discussions in ways that make them difficult and really make the progress that we can make limited if we really get into discussions about deservedness as opposed to effectiveness. So my background, I've been working in this space, as I said, for almost 20 years. I've worked as a clinical social worker in just about every program that you can imagine. I started out in foster care, worked through foster care for multiple years. I've ran senior care services, veteran services, mental health clinical services, you name it, I've done it. I've had just a really incredible opportunity to get involved in a lot of different programs and see a lot of different work on the ground, and that's actually my privilege. I can honestly say that most of my worst days are listening to other people share their worst days, and it's a privilege to be able to even think about things in those terms, because I've always had basic needs met. I've always had a place to live. I've always had food. I've always had utilities. I've always had warm when it was cold and cold when it was warm, and that itself is a privilege to be able to talk about this work from afar and not having to have lived in it. So today, my intent is to kind of cover two broad topics. Right now, I work for an organization that has kind of taken an innovative approach to poverty reduction, and it's a social venture. So we're combining a kind of a market rate business with a social need, specifically homelessness and generational poverty. So I want to talk about that. That's EPIC, the Grooming Project. But before that, I just want to talk about some core philosophies that help inform the work that I've done, that I've found really helpful in really clearing out some of the brush that gets in the way of effective policy, and then how those have applied at Epic, because we have been able to do some pretty cool things. So this is the goal for today. I want to spend the first half of my time talking more about core philosophies, the second half talking about the grooming project and how those have applied in that setting. And obviously would love, this doesn't have to be a one-way street. So questions in the chat as they come up, happy to answer those because I think they will help me understand how this information is landing with all of you as well. So having said that, let's just get right into this. So we're going to get pretty deep, pretty quick. Because I just think there's a lot of really rich content to talk about. And I really want to get into some of the areas where we start seeing collisions. So I'm going to share a story. This is something that is true. This happened probably 8 years ago now. I was working with a colleague at a place. We were both licensed clinical social workers. She moved on to a different organization that did similar work. And about 6 months after she left, she called me and said, I have this case I'm working on. I'm looking for some assistance because I'm not sure what to do. So she proceeded to tell me that she had a 26-year-old mom who had 6 children by 4 different fathers. This mom had not ever worked. She had been living with family and friends, kind of bouncing around, couch hopping, anybody that would take her. And she was with her cousin and had burned that bridge, and her cousin was about to kick her out. And so they were going to be homeless by the end of the week if there wasn't a resource found. And so this former colleague was just asking, do you know of anything, do you know of any place, any resource that we could use because we don't want this family to be homeless? Now, I share that part of the story because for a lot of people, just that piece tends to trigger some pretty negative feelings about that person. When I share this in groups, quite often the questions I get are judgments like, who would have 6 children without having the resources to take care of them? That's really poor decision making. And at best, it's just kind of indifferent, right? It's out of sight, out of mind. It's not really my problem to deal with. And so I had some of those similar reactions. I had some of that initial feeling of this is overwhelming, this is a lot. What can we really do here? And so I just want you to take that part of the story and think about what your reaction was. And the next part of the story is this former coworker, proceeded to share with me that this mom, when she was 12, she was kidnapped by her stepfather, was taken to a different country, was sold into sex trafficking, and all of her children are a product of rape by her stepfather or by people that she was trafficked to. Now, generally, when I share that part of the story, there's a major shift in the room. When I'm working with social service staff, quite often there's at least some understanding that something else is probably relevant here, that we just don't know the whole story. And when I'm working with groups who maybe aren't involved in social services and haven't been exposed to that kind of trauma, then it's more negative. But in either instance, regardless of the room, the second part of that story tends to really change people's perception of what needs to happen here. The first part of that story, sometimes you kind of get mixed reactions on whether or not we should provide any support, whether there should be public funding to provide support for this situation. And once the second part of that story is unlocked, our perceptions tend to completely change. Now this person is deserved of help, whereas before, maybe they weren't, or at least it was much more of a questionable interaction versus obvious that we need to do something here. And I think there's something actionable in that space because what we know about homelessness and what we really know about every social issue is that the cost to our communities is exactly the same, no matter our judgments about why the person is in the situation they're in. And so this is one study out of the United States that is been replicated several times, and it's generally something in this range. So it's not always this exact figure, but it's generally something pretty close, that per person, on average, homelessness costs our communities about $35,000 a year. And this is for people who work in this space. I know I'm speaking to the initiated here. If you don't have housing, quite often you're utilizing emergency services at a substantially higher rate. So you're getting the emergency services called on you, or your 911, whatever that version of 911 is across the world. You're accessing emergency services a lot more, either by choice or by force. And emergency services cost a lot more and are quite often unfunded. And so anybody who is living in a situation where they don't have stable housing, it's quite often costing a lot more for that person to be maintained by that community because they're accessing emergency services. And each time that this has been studied in just about every arena and just about every population, there are a few exceptions, but not many. When we provide stable housing, we see those costs come down to the point where there's a cost savings when compared to doing nothing. And so just from a pure fiscal pragmatic standpoint, when we're stripping away judgment completely and when we're stripping away a moral context completely, there's a pretty strong case that it's actually just cheaper to provide support on the front end instead of waiting until something is a crisis on the back end. And this is, I think, just a common theme across multiple social service fronts. This is true in healthcare. It's generally cheaper to prevent major health crisis than it is to intervene after the fact. The case is generally true with something like homelessness as well. So the common theme for me over the time that we're going to share here is that all of this fits the same pattern. That there's a pragmatic fiscal reason to address this too, and I'll talk about the possible moral reasons, but I think we can be more clear-headed in just recognizing that we don't have to get stuck in who deserves help and who doesn't to have a good case to do something about this, because this is costing us and it's really jamming up some of our emergency services. I know that's true here too. So this for me is always relevant. Every time I see one of these studies and it's the same result, is that it's just cheaper if we intervene on the front end as opposed to waiting until there's a crisis. So with that in mind, deservedness, I think, just stagnates social policy. And again, this is my stuff. This is just my own opinion, my own experience. Could be different for others. I've been working in the space for a while, and what I've noticed is in every discussion about what we should do when we have populations who consistently end up with less economic stability, the idea of deservedness constantly creeps into this conversation. And I say creeps, it actually forces its way in. Sometimes it starts there and never ends. It's just an entire conversation about deservedness. So what I've noticed there is that we lose sight of what the actual goal is. If we're focused on who should be helped and who shouldn't, then we're putting a whole bunch of our resources towards eligibility criteria. And when we're not actually spending enough of our resources on actual support and help, we're using it to try to determine who deserves it and who doesn't. And so that tends to create system complexity. So people who don't have a whole lot of resources to begin with end up having to jump through a lot of hoops just to prove that they actually need this support. That's often confusing because things change. And when needs on the grounds change or circumstances change, the eligibility criteria then has to change. And if it doesn't, then it's behind. And so there's a constant changing of what people have to do to access it. And it's also, I think it just creates an impossible gridlock because people are always going to have competing ideas about what someone else should have done to avoid a crisis. It's very easy from afar to look at somebody else's life and say, well, they should have made this decision. And had they done that, they wouldn't be in a position of needing support at a public level. And I think it's an impossible conversation to find consensus on. And if not impossible, really, really difficult. So we can just about bet that in that discussion, if we're framing it that way, we're going to get stuck a lot. We're going to constantly run into each other's intuitions about choices and deservedness and hard work and lack of work. And I think that if we really expect to make progress on these topics and on these issues, then we need to find a way to not get stuck in that conversation. And I think there is a way to do that. So for me, it's really kind of a competing conflict between bad choices and bad circumstances, these two ideologies. Bad choices, if we reduce poor living conditions for some people to them having made bad choices, then that's a justification for ultimately not really doing much. I mean, what we've landed on is that if those individuals just made different decisions, they'd be in a different position. And so there's really not much left for us as a community or as a public apparatus to do other than to chastise those individuals for not making better decisions. If we think about it as bad circumstances, and we see poor living conditions as a result of a poor circumstance, then there's a justification for action. We can start looking at what caused this circumstance, what keeps causing this circumstance, and how can we change the circumstance so that people don't have to make the choices that they're making. I find that approach to be better. I think it's better for discussion, and I think it's better for solutions. And so we're going to talk a lot about that. So the philosophical bedrock of this for me is that most people most of the time behave in the same way when they're placed under the same circumstances. And so I know it doesn't feel that way because anybody who's in a situation where they have their basic needs met, you know what it felt like to get there. You know that you worked hard. You know that you put in the time. You know that it was a struggle sometimes. And so that feeling, it feels like we did everything that got us to the place that we're in. And so the assumption off the back of that is if somebody's not in the same place as me, then they must not have worked as hard. They must have not made the same effort. They must not have the same skill set. And I think it's very easy to get behind that because that is a bit of an illusion, right? I mean, we're going to talk about the vast majority of people who are living in poverty or living without stable housing. They've had trauma in their lives since the moment they were born. I've been fortunate to never have to deal with any of that. And that doesn't mean that there aren't some circumstances and there aren't some exceptions where somebody manages to outrun all of that baggage and end up in a good place. But if we look at how frequently and really how infrequently that happens, I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot more going on here than someone making quote unquote bad choices. And so I really think if we're focused on choice, we're probably not going to come up with good reasons to provide public policy responses. If we're focused on circumstance, then we can really start trying to identify what's creating the circumstance that continues to lead people into places of destitution. And so for me, this kind of pivots back into a humanistic argument, which is just I am always taken back by how much human creativity and beauty and potential and ingenuity that we're just leaving on the sidelines because we have so many people who all they get to do since the day they were born is spend their time and attention trying to survive. And that's really heartbreaking to see, especially when you see it up close, because you see these wonderful skills and these beautiful personalities locked up in these individuals who all they ever know and all they've ever gotten to do is try to survive and try to find food and try to find shelter. And so we just don't ever get to see the benefit that that person could be providing to others and the things that they could be creating in the community that they could be contributing to because they just never had a chance. And for me, that's the pragmatic argument's pretty obvious. I think that argument is pretty obvious too once we get underneath some of the judgment about people who are in these positions, because there's just so much that we're leaving on the table, and it's right there for us to unlock if we find a different way to share some of the wealth and some of the prosperity that a lot of us get to enjoy and experience. So for me, this work has always been helpful as just a reminder, and this is especially true working directly with people. If you've worked in spaces with people who have a lot of trauma, who are high needs, it's almost certainly the case that you've seen behaviors that are frustrating, that are threatening, that are scary. And so it's not that there isn't a line where somebody has clearly crossed it, and regardless of the reason why, there has to be an action taken to create safety and to create continuity. But this I always find helpful, and this is from a doctor named Martin Teicher, and it's basically the basic idea of the impact that trauma has, especially when it's introduced early on. And so the graph here, we're going to talk about this lion picture here in a second. This is leading into that. Assuming a neural neutral start, so somebody at birth hasn't had any trauma yet, they're healthy physically and developmentally. And so if traumatic stress is introduced when someone is an infant, and this is true of in utero as well, then their brain starts preparing for a tough world. So if you're, as an infant, if you're constantly in environments of struggle and you're constantly deprived of the things that you need to thrive, then your body and brain starts developing for survival. And what that means is that you're generally more edgy and you have a shorter temper, then you're more impulsive and you're more hypervigilant because you have to be. And if you weren't, you would be putting yourself at risk when you're in dangerous situations. And so those are the kinds of behaviors that I see pretty regularly from people that we work with in impoverished spaces, because that's what's allowed them to survive on the streets or in the conditions that they've had to live in. That person is more prepared for dangerous settings. But those behaviors don't tend to translate well to, say, work environments. Um, if you've been hurt every single time you follow directions, and if everyone you've ever trusted has hurt you, then a supervisor giving you a directive to do something doesn't feel like a work directive. It feels like a threat. And so the part of, I think, the struggle here is that when people have been conditioned to survive, it's not easy to integrate back into safe environments, and it's not going to happen immediately. It's not a matter of just giving a person an opportunity to be safe, because it doesn't feel safe and there's no reason to trust that it's safe right away. And so this, I think the struggle here is that as long as we continue to have conditions that create a whole lot of poverty and a whole lot of trauma for some people, changing that isn't going to happen overnight. We're going to have to do it in phases and iterations, and there's going to have to be a lot of understanding that we're going to sit in that space and deal with some things that look really difficult on the surface, and they are, but they can only change once there's a reason for people to trust that it's safe now. And so for most of us, we don't have to deal with that. You know, I put myself in this category. I didn't have traumatic stress as a child. My family wasn't rich by any means. We were paycheck to paycheck, but I didn't know that because I never had to deal with it, because I had the things that I needed and a fair amount of things that I wanted. And I didn't know that we were generally one paycheck away from that not being true, because we never had that crisis that caused us to just not have basic needs met. So for me, I'm more the bottom path. I'm pretty laid back. I tend to think first and act second. I have the luxury of doing that. So I work really well in work environments. If things got really hairy, I may not be the best person to lead the group because I may not have the survival skills that somebody who's had to do it does. And so I think this is part of what we're seeing too, is that when we do enact programs that are intended to address this, we see some of those initial behaviors that cause us pause, and then we give up, or we jettison the program, or we start partitioning the program access off from people who behave that way when that's actually who needs it the most. And so we're going to talk about that too, because I think that's part of the challenge here, is it's not easy to intervene once we've created communities and environments where people are pretty constantly left behind. So I find this work to be really helpful. This is from a neuroendocrinologist named Robert Sapolsky. He's written a couple books. One was called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which is just a fantastic title for a book. And so what he talks a lot about and what he's studied is kind of stress in the animal kingdom and stress in humans. And so one of his basic concepts is that in nature, quite often for animals, stress is extremely short. It's high intensity and really quick. And so if you're a zebra and you spend most of your time just kind of hanging out and not doing much, grazing and laying in the sun, there's no stress there. You start getting chased by a lion, it's immediate stress. It's over quick. You either get away or you get eaten. And if you get away, you're back to grazing and hanging out, and there's just not a whole lot of stress there. So it's generally a life of not much going on and then high intensity stress, and then it's over one way or another. For humans, quite often we have kind of this low intensity, steady stress. So for most of us, there's just kind of a steady, low nag of stress. It's bills, it's family, it's relationships, it's jobs. So our physical presence quite often isn't in danger. We're just constantly ruminating about little stuff that if something went wrong tomorrow in one of these areas, it probably wouldn't be the end of us, but it's just kind of a constant stress. For people living in poverty, the research around this is that it's basically like being chased by a lion all the time. It's steady state, high intensity stress, which is why the brain formation here pretty regularly leads to behaviors that come across as aggressive and are aggressive, because that has to be the case to survive in unsafe situations. And so I think it makes perfect sense that we don't always see the things that we expect from somebody who it looks like there's an opportunity here and they're not taking advantage of it, because this person has been living in a state of the mental equivalent of being chased by a lion all the time. So for me, this is always just a reminder, especially when I'm seeing behaviors in response that seem out of place. They're out of place in safe settings. They're not out of place for somebody who's never been in a safe setting. So adverse childhood experiences, I think most of you probably are aware of what these are. It's essentially 8 things that can happen as a child that create a lot of trauma. And so physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, parental substance abuse, mental illness, suicide or death, or being in a family where somebody is in prison or is regularly committing crimes. These things have been identified as adverse childhood experiences. So if they happen when you're a child, they tend to impact your development into adulthood. And the more of these that you experience as a child, the more likely you are to find yourself living in poverty or not being able to hold down a job, having a tough time maintaining relationships. And so the reason I bring this up is because there's an extremely strong correlation between ACEs and things like homelessness. And so when we talk about poor choices or poor circumstances, I think it's really helpful to look at this through the lens of what choice does one have if all they've ever known is trauma. It may look like a choice for everyone outside looking in, but what choice is it really for the person if all they've ever been able to do is try to survive? And so there's a lot of research around this. This comes out of the University of Southern California, and it's pretty straightforward. For people who have experienced a lot of ACEs, men and women both, the likelihood of that person experiencing homelessness is substantially higher. Which makes perfect sense. Again, if all you've never known is trauma since the day you were born, it's going to be really difficult to integrate into any setting that's going to provide economic or educational stability. And that's before you even get into any of the race or class issues that may partition someone off or make it harder for them to access educational or occupational opportunities. So even if you can access it, if you've got that operating in your background and you're constantly worried about threats, perceived or real, it's going to be really difficult to find success in these spaces right away. And so for this, the summary for me is that preventing crisis is cheaper than intervening after the fact. And this is just true across just about every front. It's especially true in areas like homelessness, poverty. I think perceptions of deservedness just make it difficult to find real solutions. And I know this is hard because this is where the conversation quite often starts and ends. Again, it's quite often the case that we just don't ever leave this space when we're talking about ways to deal with this. And I think it's really incumbent upon us not to judge each other for having that reaction, but to recognize that it is a reaction that isn't really aligned with the goals that we all seem to want. I think we would all agree that these are problems that we should address. I think we're talking more about means and less about ends. And so once we've agreed on the ends, then we can really start backing our way into what actually gets us there. And I think what we've found, at least what I've experienced, is that focusing on eligibility criteria and deservedness doesn't tend to result in us being able to ameliorate in any substantial way the challenges that we're trying to address. So if we're looking at it more as prior causes create poor circumstances, and then poor circumstances really dictate choice, then we're focused more on how do we change the circumstance. Because if we just come back to people need to make better choices, there's really not much for us to do. And trauma leads to homelessness. Homelessness causes more trauma. And once that cycle starts, it's really, really difficult to get out from under it. And this is another area where just asking people to do things differently is really asking someone to be superhuman. We're asking them to do something that no other person would ever do in any other setting. And we're going to talk a lot about that too, because I'm going to shift now to EPIC, the grooming project. So I'm going to start with just a video that gives an overview of what we do because it is different. It's a bit unique. I think we're the only organization in the United States that does what we do the way that we do it. EPIC, EPEC, is empowering the parent to empower the child. So we were really wanting to focus on 2 generational approaches. I think everybody recognizes that if we can help children who are living in poverty and living in unstable environments, if we can help that environment stabilize, the odds of them not being in the same situation as adults and thus not recreating that same situation for their children increases. But it doesn't make sense to work with children and not with their parents because their parents are the ones trying to provide that stable environment and often not finding the resources they need to do it. And so empowering the parent to empower the child was the umbrella idea. And what we were really focused on at our founding was creating bridges to living wage industries. How can we connect people to sustainable living wage income who otherwise may not have access to it? And so we were looking at 4 or 5 different industries, and pet care was one of the industries that we were focused on. And pet care, and specifically pet grooming, it took off in the United States in 2016 when we started. It's doubled in size as an industry since then. It's projected to triple on top of the doubling in the next 10 years. So the grooming project was going to be one project within Epic, and it has become the only project within Epic, which has created some brand confusion. So we're working on that too. But the short version of what we're up to is that we've really combined a market need, which is pet grooming, with this social need, specifically impoverished moms. And we've started training moms that are experiencing homelessness in dog grooming, and then placing them at salons or hiring them at our own salons, where they start making $20 to $25 an hour in the United States. And so that's well above the minimum wage. It's about double the minimum wage, and it's well above the living wage that a lot of our worker rights organizations are fighting for, which is generally about $15 an hour. And so we've just found this to be a really kind of effective way to take 2 issues, one demand on the market side and one demand on the social side, and work them together so that we don't have to try to artificially inflate anything. And so I'm going to talk about, first, I just want to show the overview video, and then we'll talk about how all the philosophies I just talked about have applied in Epic to create the program that we create, because we take, I think, a different approach compared to a lot of organizations out there. So this video is about 4.5 minutes long. I'm fairly certain you can hear the sound because we tested it, but if I start playing this and you can't hear it, please flood the chat with insults and frowns and thumbs down, and I will fix it, or I will try.
I have moved on. I was making minimum wage.
Oops, that was me. Hang on just a second. I'm going to get there, I promise. There we go.
I was making minimum wage at my job that I was working at.
I became a felon about 7 years ago.
I grew up with a lot of abuse in my home.
I was living in public housing.
It's hard living on the streets. You have cold weathers, you have no food, you have no socks, no shoes, you have nothing. You're left with nothing when you are homeless. I left home when I was about 13. It was back and forth. I'd go home, I'd run away, I'd go home, I run away. At one point in my life, I got addicted to drugs. And that's when I went into transitional living, got pregnant with my first son, and then after I got pregnant with my first son, I ended up being homeless for 5 years.
I was a teenager, and when I had my first child, and I didn't complete school.
I had my first child when I was 15. It was pretty tough being so young, becoming a parent. It was hard. I got rushed into adulthood, becoming a mother at such a young age. Before I came to the Grooming Project, I was working at McDonald's on the night shift, doing 10 to 6 in the morning.
I would have to do like 16-hour shifts in order to make ends meet.
I didn't have the proper education, or I didn't have the proper training that they were looking for.
For thousands of women in our city, the starting place becomes a stuck place for them and their children. That's why Epic, Empower the Parent to Empower the Child, is moving fast to help them beat the odds by creating what they need most: job skills to help break the cycle. The Grooming Project teaches dog grooming and life skills in a 6-month training course and places graduates in well-paying, family-friendly jobs. Jobs they love, jobs that matter.
When I first heard about the Grooming Project, I was at Operation Breakthrough. When I looked into it, I was like, oh, this is like right up my field.
I grew up with animals my whole life, cats, birds. That's just how I was raised. We always had animals in our house.
It was right where I needed to be at the right timing. I didn't think I was gonna like it at first.
I had a lot of anxiety.
When I first started, I did not want to answer phones. I did not want to be around customers. I did not want to talk to anyone.
It's hard, but it's gotten a lot better.
I've been there about 7 or 8 months now, and I've been told that I'm one of the best groomers there.
I love it because I'm able to help someone that can't speak for themselves. And I can feel their pain that they're going through if they have a hurt paw, pad, anything. And I can be able to cut their hair.
As our students create daily transformations on their furry clients, they transform their own confidence, their abilities, and their places in the world.
I'm no longer on Section 8. I'm no longer on food stamps, so I'm able to stand and be able to provide for my family.
Now that I have moved on, I live in a house now. I have a water bill, a light bill, gas bill. I am not on food stamps or anything. It feels good. No doubt about it. It really feels good.
Well, I make anywhere from $2,200 to $2,500 every 2 weeks. I feel good.
The real winners of the grooming project, the people it was designed for, are the children.
The Epic Grooming has taught me so much in saving my money and learning how to plan for the future.
My children can see that I'm happy again, that I'm not sad all the time for not having a decent paying job, and I'm not frustrated with trying to figure out how I'm going to pay my bills. It's a real good feeling knowing that I have a job.
The Grooming Project has helped so much because I'm able to be with my children. I'm able to come home with them and interact with them, read, smile, love them, and letting them know that you can always depend on mommy.
Help us speed up the work at the Grooming Project so more families can move forward faster.
So that always gives me, I remember that first group. So a lot of those students, when they get to us, it's exactly what you would expect. I mean, it's for us, the quantitative side is the income, it's the migration to self-sufficiency. But our staff get to see somebody who, when they first get to us, they're just looking at the floor. And you can see that they've just been kind of broken. And, to see somebody's chin come up and a lot of the confidence come back. And again, I think there's just so much of that potential that we're just leaving on the table because people never get a chance to breathe. They never get a chance to actually think about the future. And we're going to talk about that too in just a second, because that's what we know this. Poverty makes the future a much less relevant place. And that's a direct quote from Robert Sapolsky as well. And it's absolutely true. There's no reason to think about what happens a month from now or 12 months from now or 3 years from now if you don't know where your basic needs are going to come from today. And so the approach that we're taking is to quit trying to hold those things hostage until someone has, quote unquote, proven that they want it, and provide those things right out of the gate so that people actually have a chance to think about what it would look like if they were able to learn this skill or go this direction. But there's no reason for anybody realistically to think about those things if they don't have their basic needs met right now. So our students, almost all of them, homeless or at risk of homelessness. I know there's a bunch of definitions of homelessness, and I find that discussion interesting too. For us, we don't spend a whole lot of time worrying about that too much. If somebody doesn't have a mailing address, if they haven't been in the same place for a month, if they don't have control of the house that they're living in, then for us, that's at risk or homeless, and we don't really get too concerned about trying to specifically define exactly what that situation is. It's one of those things where you know it when you see it, and so we can get specific on definitions if we need to, but for the most part, we're really just trying to focus on stability overall. Most of our students have virtually no income when they get to us, so if they have any at all, it's generally food stamps or some type of public benefit. Most of our students don't have a lot of education, and then about a third of our students have a criminal record of some sort when they get to us. So I mentioned our approach. The first 6 to 9 months, we're providing the job training itself, but starting before that and simultaneously with that, we're providing everything that we can to try to help create stability. And when I say we are providing, we're using partners, we're using support in any way that we can find it for housing, childcare, and transportation. Those are the big three. Those three things are not in place. It's not reasonable to expect someone to be present, even if they can get there physically. There's no reason to expect somebody to be there emotionally if they don't know where they're going afterward, if they don't know if their kids are safe, or if they have to rush and scramble because they don't have transportation. So they're flying in 30 minutes late and then they have to leave early. It just doesn't make sense to expect someone to be present emotionally if they have to deal with those things. So our training program starts with support case management to try to help create stability before we expect someone to show up for job training 5 days a week. And so that typically takes 6 to 9 months, the training side. It's 644 hours of hands-on instruction from our pet grooming instructors. And then we actually have an 18-month post-graduation support program because the transition is often the hardest part. When somebody gets a job and starts making a living wage, they start losing access to any of the support they were getting, and they quite often have to move. So they're moving closer to wherever the new job is. Their kids are starting in a new school. They're moving into a new neighborhood, and they're starting and just kind of taking this trust fall into this new space. And so we provide a lot of support post-graduation. We found that that's actually the pivotal point. It's harder than the training because it's where the rubber meets the road on the new life. And so we provide just as much support after graduation as we do prior. We're going to talk about housing here specifically too in a second because we had to take a different approach there than we were expecting. But for us, safety has to come first. Then we can start focusing on skill development. I'm going to pause for a second. I'm in a really creaky chair. So if you're hearing things in the background that sound like you're not sure where they're coming from, it's the chair, I promise you. Most of our students, they've been trained to survive, right? This is all they've known. I was talking about ACEs. Our students, of those 8, it's rare that anybody has less than 5. I mean, we're talking about when we read through the case files of our students' lives, it is a horror story. I mean, it's heartbreaking to see the things that are happening to people before they have any say in the matter at all. So people that they've trusted have broken that trust, and quite often the people around them have lived the same life that they have. They too have grown up knowing nothing but trauma and poverty, and they too only know how to survive. And so for our students, following directions often gets them hurt. So when they first get to us, we have to expect that it's going to be we're going to butt heads initially. There's going to be a fair amount of obstinance and oppositional defiance because threats come in every form, even if the instructors that are giving directives have no intention of threatening. And so we have to create a sense of safety first. If we don't do that, nothing else is going to happen. We shouldn't expect anything else to happen. And so for us, it's how long can we stay in the pocket? How long can we stay in that space and work through some of those initial struggles and help prove to people that it's safe here? That's the other challenge for us, is that when somebody leaves us, it's not always going to be safe then. So we can't just get rid of the behavior completely, and we can't tell that person you need to never behave this way. They need that defense when they leave sometimes. So for us, it's more compartmentalizing. It's okay here to let that go and just work with us. And if you need to pick it up when you leave here, we're hopefully in some amount of time, we're going to help change that situation too. But it really, if we were holding the same standard day 1 as we would month 6, no one would make it because there's no reason for anyone to trust us because we haven't proven that we're trustworthy yet, and no one has in their lives quite often. And so again, it would be abnormal for someone to come to us and just trust. That would probably put that person in danger when they left. So there's no reason to expect to see it out of the gate or to hold the expectation and then be punitive in response when people aren't. And so this is really what we see. I mean, going back to that idea, I mean, we work with people who it's very clear that it's like they've been being chased by a lion their whole lives. And 9 months is a long time to trust that you're going to drop your focus on all that basic needs stuff to focus on the future, which is why we have to be very diligent in helping provide it. Because if there's cracks in those basic needs areas, there's no reason for someone to trust that this is going to be safe enough for them to pay attention to something else. And something else that I've noticed for myself is that reflection and purpose, it's a luxury. It's a luxury to be able to talk about things in that way. It's a luxury to be able to talk about the purpose that I want in my own life, and to reflect on how I'm feeling. That takes time, and it takes stability, and it takes calm and peace to even have a space to reflect and to think about purpose. And so this is ultimately what kind of we want for our students. We want them to be in a place where they can have leisure time, and they can have time to just think about what they want, as opposed to constantly being worried about what they need. So the results here, our students average about $23 an hour. That's what they earn. Highest graduates is making about $70,000 a year. And I think it's going to be $100,000 this year. One of our graduates is on pace to earn more than $100,000. And so we're seeing just massive jumps in income, but it doesn't happen without all that other support that we're providing. And so housing, I want to show you this video. It's always awkward to watch myself here, but we were just really struggling on the housing front for reasons that I'm guessing just about everyone deals with. Most of our students have backgrounds that make them look like a major risk on paper, and our housing market is not incentivized to house people who look like a risk, because some of them may actually be a risk. I mean, they may be in a situation that they're more likely to do something that violates terms of a lease. So we got so frustrated with constantly struggling to find housing for our students, or to help them find housing, and it was really impacting their ability to be present in the program, that we decided to build it ourselves. There's a million things here to talk about. The fundraising aspect of this is something that I think I could talk about for a long time, because I've been really fortunate to be successful there. It also is frustrating that that our system is kind of set up this way, where we have to go raise private dollars for these things. And then it's just kind of this back and forth where we're trying to, for lack of a better word, coerce people into supporting things like this. But I say all that to say we're extremely grateful where we're at right now, because we've got a lot of great supporters, and they made this happen. When we started talking about providing housing, those core philosophies were front and center. We did not want to create something that wasn't dignified. We didn't want to create something that caused people to feel like they were second-rate citizens or not citizens at all. We didn't want them to feel like this was just a throwaway. And that unfortunately is what a lot of our emergency or transitional housing turns into, because it's so difficult to find funding for. It ends up being kind of low quality, unsafe, and it just kind of creates trauma too. And so it's well intended, and it may still serve a purpose, but it's not always calibrated as exactly the way it could be. So for us, we just said, if we're going to do this, we're going to build something that is dignifying and that creates a sense of pride and honor in people, so that they will reciprocate. And we were really, we felt very strongly that if we did it this way, that we would see the best of people, and that we wouldn't need to worry about damages or people misbehaving or any of that stuff. That if we provided an environment that people could take pride in, that they would reciprocate and take care of it and be their best selves. So I'm going to share this video. This is the kind of the genesis of the dorm that we built for our students that they get to live in while they're working through the training program. And while I'm playing this, I'm going to close my window because there's some sirens going on outside. So hopefully I can two birds at one stone this.
The story of the Grooming Project. So the story of the Grooming Project starts in 2016. The Grooming Project was created to train homeless single moms in dog grooming. We were really focused on trying to create living wage opportunities for people who otherwise wouldn't have them. The Grooming Project students are quite often people who've experienced trauma for as long as they've known consciousness and known the world. And that creates quite often it creates a background that makes it really difficult to get employment, and especially to find living wage employment. For a few years, we were running the program, and we were learning how it works. We were learning how effective it was, and what we were finding was that when someone wasn't able to finish the program successfully, there were generally three key barriers that were getting in the way. The first was childcare. Childcare is quite expensive, even if you are making a living wage, and it's quite often not always in the best location. So if you're trying to catch a bus and you have 2 or 3 children, getting them to a childcare location is one thing, being able to pay for it is another, and the combination of those two quite often make it inaccessible. The second barrier is transportation. Being able to hop in a car is a luxury for a lot of us, but for a lot of the students we have, that isn't something they have access to. The last barrier was housing. We just were struggling to find consistent resources for. And so after struggling with finding housing for our students, we decided to just take control of this and build it ourselves. So we started planning, we started raising money. We have an incredible group of supporters who helped us do this. And once we got those two things done, we brought together a group of volunteers and builders, and we built it. So the designing and planning for this building, we really focused on community first. So each floor has a fully furnished living room and a fully stocked kitchen. The kitchens are equipped with a refrigerator and a pantry for each family. We really wanted to provide a sense of privacy too for our residents. And so each room has its own washer and dryer and its own bathroom. And through the enormous generosity of some of our supporters, we're able to fully furnish the rooms as well. And the furniture that is in that room, the residents will get to take with them when they leave. The downstairs has a office for any type of in-service provider who can come in and provide services to residents, and a fully equipped computer lab. So we are so happy that this building is finished. We're going to be offering a lot of programming here. Just know that no matter who you are, no matter what your background is, when you walk through these doors, you're home.
So what wasn't captured there is there's a playground in the back now too. That came in a little bit late. It was delayed, but another area, just like watching that each time, it's the recalling just the struggle, and then seeing the responses that we got when students were given access to this building, and they were just looking at us like, I get to live here. What do I have to do? And the response was, you don't have to do anything. You just have to participate in the program and show up and be the best version of yourself that you can, and that's it. Like, that's all we're asking. And so it was one as a reinforcement of the lives that people had been living, because they just didn't think that they deserved it. They just didn't think that was something that they should get to do without having to give something. And I think that just reminded me of the transactional nature of a lot of the relationships that they've probably been in, where it was get what you can get and get out, because this isn't going to last. But for us, it's been exactly what we were expecting. We've had virtually no behavioral issues there. I mean, we don't have a house parent. We don't have someone there 24/7. We get to know our students. They get to know us. We trust them. We tell them if there's something that goes on there. If you make a mistake, if you do something that you weren't supposed to do, tell us. We'll work through it. There's very few things that we can't work through if we're communicating and being honest with each other. We don't expect perfection. You're going to make mistakes sometimes. You're going to relapse. You're going to have problems. It's not going to be a straight line. Let's work together on this. And for the most part, it has been effective. It's just been exactly what we were expecting. A really cool thing that we were able to do was, this is a block away from our training school. And so it eliminates transportation barriers too, because people can walk within 5 minutes. They can be at our school, and there's an elementary and a pre-K within 200 yards of the dorm too. So you can walk your infants to daycare, and then your children to school, and then be at work in 10 minutes without ever having to pay a single dime for gas or hope that a bus or a car is going to get you there. So what we've learned from this, and I'm going to wrap this up in probably 5 or 10 minutes, so there's some time for discussion if somebody wants. The dignity means trust too, and trust is reciprocated. Now we obviously screen on the front end, so we're trying to get as close to kind of severe needs as we can without dipping into an area where we just can't be effective. There are some people sometimes whose symptoms are so severe that we're not the best answer for them, at least not yet. Some of those folks do come back when they've received a different kind of support, which I think we could talk about forever too. That there are tiers to this, and that if we're want to be the most effective that we can, we have to be very specific about what we're treating and when. For us, if housing isn't first, often the rest just doesn't matter. It doesn't really matter what else is provided or what is available or what opportunities exist. If somebody doesn't have a place where they know they're going to be safe that they can go to. Pet grooming is one industry. I think this fits in a lot of different industries. So, I mean, pet grooming doesn't travel everywhere. Around the United States, it does. It's an industry that's just exploding. But I think the idea, the concept can fit anywhere, but it has to be bundled. I don't think it works if it's access to job training without the support to allow somebody to truly be present to take in that training and to hone their skill set. And once we've kind of married those two things together, access to living wages can be a solution for able-bodied people. And it's about the only way that they can really rely on making enough money to thrive and to not have to hope that there is consistency in political wins to keep providing program support. That's the other struggle, is that is such a volatile space that programs stop and start and there's no continuity. So people they don't know what to expect the next day. So building bridges to existing markets, it can be a big tent solution. That's the other thing we found about this, is because there is a job tied to it, we bypass a lot of the ideological struggles. We just don't have to have those discussions. And if we did, we probably wouldn't agree with a fair amount of the people who are supporting what we're up to, because it never gets to that part of the discussion, because there is a job tied to the end of the program. And so we just kind of bypass some of that, kind of those historical gridlocks when we're talking about how should we provide support, because we just kind of get around the conversation about deservedness in that way too. Some other, the pet grooming industry, the reason that this works for us specifically is because of the growth of this industry. And because of that, we have 100% job placement. Everybody has an opportunity to job who gets through the program because the need is so high that it's always there. So this has been really great for us to see that our students just always have a chance, and they can go through a couple of iterations. If they get hired somewhere and they don't like it, there's somebody else that will hire them immediately, because the demand is so high in this industry. And again, I don't know how this tracks to other geographies, but I'm guessing that there are kind of growing industries that a similar concept can be applied. Their one unique aspect of dog grooming is that the human-animal bond is something that just kind of gets baked into this on accident. And it's really cool because our students, one of their biggest feedback points is that learning to regulate yourself is how you help keep the dog calm, because dogs are mirrors of your emotions. And so that translates to the patience that they have with their children. So that's something that may not track to other industries, but the basic idea of helping connect people to living wages, that can track. So the other thing that we've learned is, obviously it's not a straight line. It's hard, it's messy. Not everyone makes it on the first try. Some don't make it, right? I mean, it doesn't always end well. Substance use is a major challenge here. People who've experienced that kind of trauma, separate from any other reason to use, they're trying to medicate any way that they can. A lot of our students don't have health insurance when they get to us, and so they're trying any way they can to numb or otherwise mitigate the pain and the constant stress that they're feeling. And so we've had to be pretty creative in how we deal with and work with people who are struggling with substance use. And so we don't have a zero tolerance. We do test a lot, and it's an ongoing conversation with our students. But if we were zero tolerance across the board, we probably wouldn't have that many students. It is very prevalent within groups that are struggling for some of the same reasons that is prevalent in groups that aren't struggling, plus several others. And so all of it's still worth doing, both fiscally and socially, even though some of these don't work out. It's still worth doing because, again, the cost savings to be had is enormous, and then the human potential that's unlocked and the sense of cohesiveness within our communities. This is worth doing even when it doesn't work perfectly every time. And then this intervention is for, it's an intervention for the parents, because they've already had a substantial part of their lives and that's already baked. but it may be prevention for the kids. And that's what we're really hoping for, is that as we help parents find stability and create a different environment for their children, that their children just grow up less likely to be in poverty themselves and less likely to have nothing but survival skills at their disposal because they haven't had to rely on those their whole lives. So, and when we know that, we've only been around for 7 years now, so we haven't had the full data set for kids of our current parents who grew up to be parents, but that's coming. But we know what we're going to see there. This is pretty well established, and so we know that's coming, but we just haven't been around long enough yet to have our own data to prove it. So to wrap up where we're going on the EPIC side, we get 300 applications a year on the student side, and we can only graduate about 25 students a year in our current space. And so we're booked out on the grooming side for 6 to 8 weeks. So we're building a new space. We're going to keep growing. We got a building that is right next to our current building. So this is also about 1.5 blocks from our dorm. And so we're going to turn this building into this building. And we're going to have a substantially bigger space, about 3 times the size, so we can train substantially more students. And we're really excited about that. We think the opportunities here are just kind of endless. And yeah, I mean, this is where we're going. I think this travels around the country too. We want to grow into other geographies. And so I think we're going to be able to do that because the same need kind of exists everywhere. And I think that's what I have. I just got a question in the chat. The statistics for homelessness in the United States, we're, depending on how you define it, we're around 1 million people in the United States that are currently homeless. But again, I think my own personal experience is that number is almost always an undercount. Because the way that we do these counts, you can only get access to so many people. And the point in time counts that we do, they're helpful. They create a baseline, but yeah, I mean, we're inevitably missing people because some people we're just not getting to survey. And so it's a survey that then turns into an extrapolation of what that could look like. So 1 million, between 600,000 and 1.5 million, depending on the year, is where we generally land. I think the number of people living in poverty in the United States is probably a better metric. And that's, that depending on the year ranges, a quarter to a third. And so, yeah, I mean, it's all relative. I mean, it's always geographically relevant of what poverty means and how it's defined and what standards of living are. But it's an ongoing challenge. I mean, and urban areas obviously are higher, and we have more people moving to cities for work-related reasons and social reasons. And so I know here in the United States, I mean, in Kansas City specifically, especially during pandemic, there was the homelessness was a really dynamic and volatile kind of statistic because there were some moratoriums on evictions that you would think may have helped, but didn't necessarily. And then when those moratoriums were lifted, then there was kind of a flood of eviction filings. And so yeah, I mean, I wish I had a better answer to that question other than it's volatile, and the official number is generally between 600,000 and 1.5 million.
Thank you so much, Judd, for answering that question, but also it's a fantastic presentation, and you and I have had many of these conversations, but I think it's probably the first time in our city that we have such a sort of compassionate view to how we can deal with homelessness, and that's one of the reasons why we wanted your presentation here, because it brings a completely different perspective in terms of how you view homelessness and how we view the homeless population itself. And of course, the fantastic response through EPIC that you've designed and you continue to grow. Colleagues, so the floor is open. Kola has put in a Mint survey question. Kola, you want to talk to that? Because there's some questions that you would like people in the meeting to answer, just to see how their thinking have shifted since the conversation we've been having. Kola, you want to chat to that quickly?
Yes, I can. Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning, John. Thank you so much for your
Thank you.
presentation. Just speaking for myself, I think I have learned a lot. I haven't really looked into the social perspective of it. And I think just hearing that, it makes you just check back and think about homelessness in a different light. So let me just share my screen. I see some people have already started answering the question. So the question is, having listened to this presentation that we've just had, how has your perception changed about homelessness, if it has? And just reflecting on the whole presentation, maybe you can just share what your main takeaway, your main highlight was. If you are not familiar with the Menti, you'll see on the top of the screen, you can go to www.menti.com and use that code, and then you can participate in the survey. And also I have dropped the link in the chat, so you can also just click on that and follow it. So I think, Dr. Mata, you can continue, and I'll just share when we have more results on this question. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Kola. Colleagues, please raise your hand, raise some questions on the chat. If you have any sort of comments, any questions. Judge, there's constantly an outcry of a group of mothers, and it happens in a couple of spots in the city, right? And there's one spot which is pretty close to my house, where this group of mothers will come in on certain days, and they will sit under the tree in a shade and safety away from the street, and then the children, and they're really small, and some of them are like probably 5 years old, and they will go into the street and they will bag, and while the parents are offering the support, and the reaction to that is often that of judgment, that kids should be taken away from them, they should be arrested, and I'm also guilty of that kind of judgment. How do we respond to that kind of situation where there's the immediate response is saying you judge these mothers for having the children or exposing their children to the environment that they do? I note your hand, V, and I'll come to you just now. So Judge, do you want to come in?
Yeah. So I have this. There's a lot of research that I found helpful around the way that poverty changes people's brains, and I presented some of that. For me, the inverse of that is true too, and the way that affluency changes people's brains, I think it's just as important. So it's difficult for me when I first see that, because it strikes a moral nerve for me. But then to step back from that and recognize that that reaction is probably coming from a place of care too initially, that there's concern about children. And yes, there's almost certainly judgment of the mother that isn't accurate or fair. And there's an assumption that if they were in the same position, they'd be doing it differently, which itself, I think, is an illusion. But for me, it's that social work perspective of meeting somebody where they're at has to apply to the people that I get frustrated with too. And so, yeah, I mean, I think the first step in that is really understanding where that person's coming from and assuming that there's some positive intent in there somewhere. Because if you can connect with that, then it's working backwards to help just have a conversation. Because I think if it's not positive intent, then there may not be anywhere to go. But I think most people, most of the time, that reaction is still somewhere rooted in care for the child that then should and can translate to care for the mom too. Because I mean, this is what I've noticed in my work, is that child will become that mom, and that mom was probably that child. So if you can have compassion for one, you're one step away from having compassion for the other. And then we're having a different conversation if we're talking with that person about, if this was your life, what do you think would be different about you that would cause you to behave differently than the person you're judging right now? And so I think that ways to do that without just immediately creating conflict with the person who's doing the judging. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if that's a helpful answer, but philosophically, just trying to even meet the people that are doing some of that judgment where they're at, for me, is always a start into the conversation. because I always end up in the same place, which is that what else would people do if they don't have any other way to get their needs met? And if you're saying that they have a different way, then let's talk through why you think they do. And let's get to the bottom of that and figure out if it's really the case or if it's just something that you're feeling from your perspective, but you don't have a way to access it from their perspective.
Yeah, it's a fantastic fantastic answer, because it really just asks us to question more the sort of reasoning behind any judgment that we place, and also to start seeing the homeless community as people with need, and they're responding to that need the best way they know how to, and there's absolutely no space for us then to judge. I mean, it's a human nature, right, to have a judgment, at least initially. My colleague V has his hand up. V, you want to come in?
Hi, good morning, Jared, and good afternoon, everybody. Jared, as you know, we're on the verge of pursuing our own study, and there's not enough data in our city to know more about our homelessness. And I was just curious to know, how do we change the perspective of the homeless people we have? As you said, you're in your city, you had, trying to bring them skills where they could be self-sufficient. Because in our city, I'm not too sure. As I said, there's not enough data to know whether they are comfortable in their own, where they would make more money from begging rather than working. As well, that also, dealing with the homelessness with mental health problems, also drug problems, because trying to get these homeless people off drugs is going to be quite a mission, and do you get funded, and how do you get funded if you need to put them into these places where they could get assistance or help? And yeah, as I said, I'm just curious because we don't have enough of our own data to go more into detail. So getting some sort of background, whether there is some sort of commonality with homelessness.
Yeah, no, I think this is the kind of the nitty gritty. This is the hard part. And for me, I think seeing it as kind of, there's probably more than 3 tiers, but 3 tiers. The first tier, and you could go in either direction, but like starting with the most severe. So there are going to be some portion of people who, for reasons that are completely out of their control, that maybe even don't have anything to do with trauma, just brain development that didn't happen in a way that allows them to interface with our communities. There are going to be some people whose behaviors are just so severe that it just doesn't work really anywhere. And I think just being honest about that, because that's just kind of a developmental reality, that's a pretty small portion, but there are going to be some individuals who it's just not there for them to access something like this. And for me, that is where kind of a true governmental answer needs to be there, because I mean, I can tell you at Epic, if we try to work with those individuals, it makes it really difficult for everybody else in the cohort, because that person's just not able to integrate. And so it kind of slows down progress for everyone else. Personally, I think that's where a true governmental intervention, that is, we're going to do everything we can to make things as safe and as happy for this person. But that may also mean that they're isolated from the capacity to potentially hurt someone else. And so, but that's a really small group. I think that the tier above that are really the kind of the focus for us, which is people who it looks like on the surface they have those behaviors, but if their environment stabilizes, you will see a completely different person. And so I think like that's really, for me, it's almost like we have to give everybody that chance to figure out which is which. And it may be that some people end up in a situation where it's just not right for them, or it's not right for them right now. On the economic side, I think that is a bigger struggle. I mean, if the opportunity to get needs met is greater, going through some of those secondary markets and kind of creating the, being the panhandling side of it, I think that's a different kind of challenge. And I mean, I think it's still addressable in finding those economies that somebody could access that would create a different kind of stability, even if the money was the same. But yeah, I mean, I don't have a great response to that if it really is the case economically that there's a better opportunity to do that than to try to plug into what I would call a traditional market versus secondary market. And so, yeah, I just don't know the economy there well enough and kind of the industry to know if there are other industries that are kind of untapped and there's just a labor demand that's unmet, that something like this could be created. I do know that if that happens, the social support, if it's not there, then you can just kind of expect failure, because there's just no reason for anybody to trust that this is actually going to translate into a better opportunity to meet their needs than the thing that they're used to, which very well could be kind of the secondary market game. But that's also what I've noticed with our students, is that people who are getting their needs met through that secondary market, they're quite often working more hours and harder than people who are working through the primary market. And so if there's an opportunity to translate that and it really does manifest into a healthy living, I found that people are willing to do it, but it has to translate. And if it doesn't, then there's no reason to trust that they could go a different way. So I don't know if that's helpful, but I know on our end, we really do need a different solution for people who have really severe needs. And the substance use piece is the same for us. I mean, everybody who has that struggle of our students, we give them that opportunity. We try to connect them with a co-occurring substance use treatment program. Some people, it works. Their substance use is directly related to stress caused by their environment. And when the environment changes, their substance use changes, and we don't have to worry about it anymore. For some of those folks, it's deeper than that. And it's something that they end up having to address separate from our program because it's just too severe. But for me, we don't really get to see that distinction until we offer the opportunity either way.
Thank you, Jared.
Thanks, Jared. I see some comments. Only 6 people could comment, so I think it's mint is always an issue. We're not all familiar with it, but colleagues, if you want to answer on that one, please go. But it seems like it's a conversation that has shifted a lot of people's thinking in terms of being more compassionate in terms of how they think about the subject matter. And of course, there's various policy issues and data issues that are related to how we then engage with homeless population in this city that needs to drastically improve. Which of course we're still going to have many of these conversations, Judd, as we navigate, the building the baseline, understanding the community. One of the key things, quick questions that I have, and I know we have like 7 minutes. What level of care do we need, and maybe it's not phrased correctly, but what level of care do we need to put in place when collecting data on homelessness? Considering the psychosocial issues, considering the very sort of difficult circumstances some of the individuals who are homeless have faced with, because we are about to collect the data, yes, but who collects the data? What kind of people? What kind of qualifications? Could we train just an ordinary data collector, an enumerator, to have that certain level of care and compassion to be able to collect the data, understand that when they've asked a question that's triggering, they know how to respond. We do have some support with social workers from the DSD, but it's something I've been grappling with. Who collects the data? How much does that one matter, and what kind of training could these field workers undertake in order before they start collecting the data?
Yeah. So I think this is great. I mean, the application of this is always. I think I've found that starting with the bare bones, the living situation, the kind of stuff that doesn't try to get underneath to the why, So getting that information first, so that like that's less likely to trigger getting that first, and then when you move into that second tier, when you're getting into the potential underlying causes or somebody's history, that either it's a different group doing that, or the person knows that we've gotten the quantitative data first. And when we move into this qualitative, it's okay if you don't get it all. It's okay if someone, I mean, it should all be voluntary, but that second piece, at any point that somebody wants to check out, the informed consent on the front end, letting people know that if you feel comfortable answering these questions, it will help us identify solutions and help us better understand the challenge. But at any point, if you don't feel comfortable answering these questions, you don't have to. And then just recognizing, I think training people to just recognize obvious behavioral cues. I mean, tears are one thing, but body language, and there's no reason to push, right? So this isn't an interrogation, and it's not really an interview. At the point that you're getting into the qualitative feedback, it's a conversation, and that conversation is controlled by the other person. So the person that's being surveyed, letting them know that they are in 100% control of that conversation, and that they get to start it, end it, share as much or as little as they want. I think that's one way to just help support the cause and the administration of it. If you do have access to mental health professionals or people with that background, so that the frontline surveyors can tag out when somebody, because it's all communication. I mean, as soon as somebody recognizes that there is a response happening here, it's okay to just ask and to let the people that you're surveying on the front end know. If something feels really hurtful to you, tell me. And if you want to speak to somebody about that specifically, we've got support here who can do that. I think that's the front end of that, is informed consent, letting that person know that you're in control of all of this, and it's up to you how much you share, and it's up to you how deep you go, and it's up to you if you want to talk through any of these issues further with me or with somebody else who may be more qualified to do so.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Judd, for answering the question. I think it helps a lot for us before we go to the field, so we have that clarity, because it would be the first time we do it as a city, and there's going to be a lot of teething issues, but we don't want those teething issues to impact negatively on the community and the individuals that we are trying to do this for, so that we set a baseline and we know how to respond. So we want to mitigate and minimize any negative impact that may come out of that.
I think power and control is everything there. The feeling of control. I think sharing that just gets you a long way before anything else.
Great. Thanks, Judd. Ola, do you want to come in with your Menti? Only 6 people seem to be able to answer your Menti.
It looks like it. I actually think with us, you can't really access the Menti on the land. So I think a lot of our internal colleagues can't access it. But I'm going to try and go out and just refresh it. But just by looking at the results that we have now, the top 2 are empowering people so that they can improve their livelihoods. And then the second one is addressing the social issues, which I think then speaks to what the program that we're talking about does, because it's a combination of both those things. So that's what has come out now. Okay, now we have 8 people that have voted, and it's still the same results. So yeah.
Yeah. No, thank you so much. I mean, it's very interesting also from our South African colleagues that it's not housing that always comes first, because it seems to, every time you talk about homelessness, people think it's just an issue of shelter. And once you address the shelter issue and everything is addressed, we've come to an end of this brown bag session. So I want to thank you, Judd, for making time to do this presentation for us and to just continuously support the work that we are trying to do. It's very meaningful for us, and it's also very important that we constantly have these conversations, So we change the way we think, and homelessness in the city, even though we don't know the numbers, but anyone who goes to work, goes to town, will be lying if they say they don't come across any homeless person in the traffic lights. It's different ranges, and we have no idea who they are. We have no idea how many children are on the streets. We have no idea how many adults. We don't have no idea how many people with mental health issues. So it's a whole lot of issues that that we really haven't gotten a grasp of. But what we then trying to do now is to engage with the provincial department, Department of Social Development, who are mandated with dealing with homelessness. But we were saying that instead of dealing with the issues of mandate, which is a political issue, and administrative and sort of mandate issues, we'll have to collaborate and see how we then move forward. So we've started those conversations. That's great. So they'll be supporting us with the homelessness study, and Judge will be helping us as well in terms of just really sort of tiptoeing, well, not tiptoeing around issues, but learning and mitigating and developing tools that aren't hurtful, even though they're not meant for that, but they're not hurtful to the community itself. So thank you so much for your time, and hopefully you could still get a nap on you could go back and just catch a little bit of a last nap, and wake up again and have your fantastic Friday. So really appreciate that.
I really appreciate it too. I've always enjoyed this, and always interested in learning and hearing the feedback, because my experience is just my own, and I know it's different for everyone, and so I always love getting involved in things like this, because I learn every time. So I really appreciate the opportunity.
So thank you kindly. So I'll let my colleague Kola to close, because it's her session, as her Brownback session, and thank the colleagues as well for making time. It's a very difficult time for us, Judd. I don't know whether I've told you in email. So we're still responding to the floods, and there are sort of rescue operations are still ongoing. I mean, it's not really rescue anymore. It's really search and retrieve, because it's been a couple of days, so there wouldn't be anyone who's still alive. So, I'm not saying there's no hope for families, but with water, with floods, it's very difficult to find anyone alive. We in excess of 300 people, 400 people passed on already. So there's a whole lot of issues, and service delivery is a big issue. People don't have water in some places, they don't have electricity, and that sparks protest. So people are starting to protest because they hadn't had water for a couple of days. So I'm grateful that colleagues could still make time despite what's going on, and yeah, fantastic. Kola, over to you, and yeah.
Thank you. Thank you to you both, Dr. Mbata and our speaker today, Mr. Judd. Thank you so much for your time, and everyone that's joined today. Like Dr. Mbata was saying, it is a pretty challenging time for all of us, but we're thankful that you made the time, and we hope that you have taken something away from this session. And we do have these sessions monthly. So if you are registered, I will be sending the appointment for the next one. And especially for our colleagues that are external, I will not have your email address. So you can just send it to me if you would like to receive communication. So with that being said, thank you so much. Enjoy your Friday, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, colleagues. Bye.
Cheers.